יהיו לרצון אמריך וגיון ליבי לפניך, אדוני צורי וגואלי. May the words of my mouth and thoughts of my heart be acceptable before you, O God, my rock, my redeemer. Shalom all, and welcome to our Kosher Torah school. I am, of course, your host, Ariel Bar Tzadok. You find me in our school online at www.KosherTorah.com. We are, in this class, going to talk about Israel. Israel meaning Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel. We'll talk about it today, talk about it tomorrow. I'm going to talk about it in culture, history, Jewish law, Halakha, talk about it in prophecy, and in all those things. Because, needless to state, the existence of the state of Israel today is actually Israel Independence Day. Happy birthday, Israel. It's 68 years old, 68 years young. 68, for those of you who know Jewish numerology, gematria, that's the numerical value of the word chaim, life. So to Israel, we bless and say to life, may Israel live long and prosper with God's blessings and grace. But now, let's talk about Medinat Yisrael. And when I use the Hebrew term, I'm speaking about the specific country of Israel right now, established 1948, on this day, which again, in the Hebrew calendar, of course, is Iyar. So anyway, getting back to the issues. What is Israel? Where does it fit into our Jewish life? Well, for those of you who would go and study the history of Zionism, to understand where the ideas came from, obviously most people will point to Theodor Herzl. But the idea of regathering and reestablishing a Jewish presence in the land of Israel most certainly did not begin with Mr. Herzl. You had other mystically and spiritually minded Jewish individuals who always had longed to return to our ancient homeland. Amongst them was Rabbi Alkali from Europe, a famous, great Sephardic Kabbalist. These are called mystical Zionists and the like. You read about them. They're out there. Material literature is out there. But obviously, Herzl is the main founder. Now, you might not be familiar with the history, so let's review it real quick. As we know, in quote, emancipation, or the growing secularization in Europe that occurred in the 18th and 19th centuries, with the growth of rationalism, science, the stranglehold of the superstition of religion in general, and of the church in particular, was starting to unwind. Protestantism was growing, and with it, so were ideas of exploration. You had numerous spiritual ideas, groups, organizations, even secret societies, that were growing pretty much since Renaissance times. Needless to say, the Order of the Masons is only one of them. We can all point to conspiracy theory and speak before them of the Knights Templar and the like. But let's move into, again, 17th and 18th century Europe, where, if you study your history well, and for those of you listening live, you will remember the comments that I made before we began our recording. I am presently even doing studies now in the proliferation of our secrets of the Torah traditions, which proliferated in both Renaissance and Enlightenment Europe for hundreds of years. You had numerous rulers of various countries that were very much dabbling into mysticism. Now, the mysticism in those days was rather different than today. Why? Because what was mystical then, what is today referred to as the occult. For the most part, in those centuries, was considered, again, for the most part of science. And you had very influential individuals in the courts of kings and queens and emperors alike, who very much sought after mystery teachings. Those which were most attractive were our secrets of the Torah tradition. And you'll notice that I'm not using the word Kabbalah, even though they do. Simply because, as we've discussed here at KosherTorah for numerous classes, I make a very strong distinction between the Spanish metaphysical philosophy of the Zohar and the schools that came out of it, and the earlier, more authentic secrets of the Torah traditions, which dealt with issues like what today would be called prophecy, meditation, and magic. Well, books, Jewish books, on these topics, while today are extremely rare to find in their original Hebrew, and even rarer to find published and accepted in modern or Orthodox circles, which doesn't say much about modern Orthodoxy, but we'll get into that later. These teachings were translated into Greek, to Latin, and with the existing, the development of the printing press, books of these nature found their ways into the libraries of many of the European gentry. Now, you can ask, well, so what? Well, it makes a big difference. Why? Because these teachings of ours influenced and inspired many of these organizations and groups, one of whom was the Masonic Lodge. Now, you could say, well, so what? Well, it makes a big difference, because the Masonic Lodge and the people who belonged to it, being influenced by our literature, embraced the concepts of the liberty and dignity of the human individual, the freedom of spirit, which might sound to you like a philosophical idea, but it's not. It's the true essence of prophetic Kabbalah. Now, the Zohar really doesn't emphasize that so verbatim, even though it does. The writings of the Ariel don't emphasize that verbatim, even though it's the essence. Remember, in the Spanish metaphysical tradition, Zoharic Lurianic, we speak about Tikkun HaShekhinah, the Tikkun of the Neshama, the rectifications and such and like. Well, all of this is, personality refinements, the growth of and maturity of the psychology of the individual, and indeed, the true understandings of Kabbalah always have been internal and psychological. And anyone who does not understand the secrets of the Torah, and all the more so later Kabbalah, in the light of psychology and inner realization, let me be blunt, Kabbalah is about psychology and inner realization. All the worlds spoken of are internal worlds. And anyone who does not see this or understand this clearly and definitively misunderstands the Kabbalistic traditions. And, sorry to have to say, for the most part, that probably is 90+% of all the people who study Jewish mysticism that have not a clue of what they're studying. But that's a problem. I mean, people look at the superficial surface level of a thing and they never get to the essence of a thing, and that's a problem. Luckily for us, we had the likes of Maimonides and his Guide to the Perplexed, Abulafia after him, that helped us understand these things. If you wish to dabble into elements and areas of Jewish magic, talismans, Maftech Shlomo, the keys of Solomon, and the like, if you think this is magic a la Harry Potter, well, you've been reading too many novels or watching too many movies. But if you recognize that these are psychological or archetypal projections of inner expressions of psychological realities, then you're beginning to understand true wisdom. These ideas were well embraced in the period of the Enlightenment. They inspired individuals to create the concepts of the values that we have today in our Western world. And if it was not for this foundation, there most certainly would not be today the existence of a modern state of Israel. So during the late 19th century, when Jewish individuals in Western Europe were very much assimilated into and accepted into the traditional European cultures for the first time in history, needless to say that absorption, and I'm not going to call it assimilation, I'm not going to get political about it, that absorption was not always well received by the non-Jewish neighbors. We all know that anti-Semitism, a hatred of Jews, has never died. It exists today prominently, and I'm not talking about Arab or extremist or even Nazi influenced anti-Semitism. I don't want to say Islamic, because ultimately Islamic was never really anti-Semitic in its origins. Muhammad, the individual, had problems with individual Jews back in Mecca and Medina who betrayed him. They were an outcast group of Nazarenes, I believe, who are the actual descendants of the followers of Yeshu. They were problematic for the Jewish people, and they continued to cause problems for Jews. But Muhammad also had many Jewish associates and allies who worked with him. So you find dual concepts of Jews expressed in the words of Muhammad. So I'm not going to refer to an Islamic anti-Semitism. That which is today proliferated throughout the Islamic world is not Islamic anti-Semitism at all. It's actually Nazi anti-Semitism. The Arabs have literally become the philosophy of a Nazi Fourth Reich, and it belittles and degrades Islam. And ultimately, if more Muslims would learn more about their true Islamic teachings, they would abandon all of this Jew hatred and recognize that that is not part and parcel of Islam. And you have a good Muslim individual who do understand that. Many who live in Israel, many live around the world. But that's not my point. To get back to our issue, you still have in the United States today, in every place in the Western world, many from the Christian world who still embrace the old ideas of Jew hatred, and the Protestant world, Catholic world alike. Well, in late 1800s, of course, there was the famous Dreyfus Affair, in which you had a captain of the French army who was, set up as a fall guy for a number of French generals who committed treason against France to Germany. And in order to cover their crimes, they blamed a Jewish underling. And being that anti-Semitism was so rampant in old France, I'm not so sure it's different today, Captain Alfred Dreyfus was blamed and sentenced and condemned. And of course protested his innocence. But there was a young reporter covering the trial, Jewish man, secular man, also well absorbed into Western culture. And when he heard the crowds condemning Captain Dreyfus, they weren't saying, condemn the traitor, condemn the traitor. They were saying, condemn the Jew. This reporter, of course, was well aware of what was going on. This reporter, of course, was Theodor Herzl. And they recognized, wisely so, that Jews as a people, unfortunately in Western societies, Christian and even Islamic societies, have suffered for thousands of years under secessionist replacement theology, first by the church, second by Islam, and have always been under their thumbs. Mind you, Jews have never suffered these persecutions in the lands that were not Islamic or Christian. We don't hear of Jewish problems in the Orient, Jewish communities in China, in Japan, India, which existed for thousands of years, even Ethiopia. No. Only in those who had theologies to replace Israel. And those prejudices and hatreds run deep. And this is why, as a practical and realistic response, Herzl developed the idea that Jews need to have a homeland of their own. Because with a homeland and a nation, they would solicit respect as being one of the nations and would have a place of safety. Now, needless to say, Herzl, I am sure, never would have conceived of the Holocaust, but recognized that Jews needed a place of their own. You can go study the history of the development of Zionism and the growth of the Yeshuv, the Jewish community, and the history of the birth of the State of Israel. And we all know, in all due respect, if it wasn't for the Holocaust, I don't think the world would have felt guilty enough to have voted for the establishment of the State of Israel. And, God works in strange ways, and we mourn the crimes of history, but we've recovered. We've grown strong. And we've developed that idea, never again. You see, the existence of the State of Israel, I'm not interested in it from a point of prophecy or religion. The State of Israel exists today because the Western world, from our Torah traditions, learned about the concepts of freedom, dignity, and respect for all people. And the founding fathers of the United States of America, of course, exported those ideas to many places around the world. And even though these ideas have taken root in different ways, in different forms, in the soils of different countries, in all due respect, those concepts of liberty, which we proclaim, I don't know how much we enjoy, here in the United States of America, are equally proclaimed throughout most countries around the Western world. Surprisingly, even in the Oriental countries, which still maintain different forms of government, you have catching up of people having these concepts. And it all came from us. So you see, Israel was founded as a place, as a haven for all Jewish individuals from around the world who could come back to our ancestral land if they so chose, and as a fallback that if and when there was ever the terrible persecutions, they would have a place of haven. Now, after the Holocaust, it became clear and evident that with all the wise enlightenment and emancipation of the Western world, no one lifted a blessed finger to help the Jews in Europe. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, no one helped the Jews. This taught the founding fathers of Israel a dark and bitter lesson. No one was going to come to help the Jew other than the Jew. And therefore, as we know, the State of Israel was established. You can go study the history. That's not really what we need to emphasize. So the existence of the State of Israel today, 68 years later, in my opinion, is even more important today than it was at the time of its founding. At the time of its founding, while anti-Semitism was as rampant in the world, still, the anti-Semitism of today, 68 years later, and many people want to say, well, it's caused by the existence of the, in quote, Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And that, frankly, is just not true. One can look into the history of the birth of the state of India and Pakistan, in which you had the bitter rivalry between the Muslims and the Hindus in India. The Muslim community wanted their own state there because they refused to live under the hand of the Hindus. And you see the same extremist mentality that existed in the Middle East. And the fact that Israel exists today. The Palestinian people have literally bred generation after generation of Nazi-based hatred into their people. And that is exported around the world. And as we very well know, it is tapped into those deep roots of Jew hatred that still exist after thousands of years. And therefore, today there's this very blurry line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Is there a difference between the two? Yes, there is. Very clear line for those who can see clearly. The problem is most do not. And you have, to this day, a tremendous amount of Jew hatred, which is out there. It's not going to dissipate, but they disguise it as anti-Zionism because it is not yet politically correct to be anti-Semitic. But that's the truth of things. So not everyone who is anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic, but unfortunately, most are. And that's just the truth of it. Now, Israel needs to exist today because, as we've seen with episodes happening throughout Europe, the growing Islamic terrorism and violence, in which, because of their own agendas and reasons, European governments, while they are emancipated and enlightened and Western and all the rest, and will clearly and definitively extend protection to their Jewish citizens, nevertheless, that cannot prevent their Jewish citizens from becoming targets of violence from radicals, as we have seen. But let's be blunt. Just because Jews are targets doesn't mean that not everyone else is not. They certainly are. Go look at the amount of casualties of all the terrorist events, whether it's bombings at airports or theaters or restaurants. The number of Jews killed in comparison to the number of non-Jews killed. Jews are obviously still in the minority. We're dealing with an evil enemy which is out to destroy everything that Western values support. And that mentality isn't even Islamic in origin. And the Islamic imams and the muftis know it. It's Nazi in origin. And that explains their techniques, their philosophies, and the like. It uses Islam as a sheath to hide its bloody sword. But that's another topic for another time. Israel must exist today as a safe haven for Jews around the world. And this is why having Israel and religion confused with one another is a very, very dangerous precedent for Jews. So you see, Israel, as we know, was originally under the British mandate. And therefore, when the state was established, thank God, luckily by secular, non-religious Jews who did not have a religious agenda, an axe to grind, included all Jews, regardless of one's orientation or background. If you're Jewish, Israel is your home, period. But being that these individuals came out of the British system, they developed or embraced a British form of government, as we know today, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. Following the same form of government in Britain, You have the parties, and if you have a majority party, that majority party elects a prime minister, which runs the government. If not, then you have to have a coalition. In Israel, of course, we know that the coalition governments have existed since the establishment of the state 68 years ago. And one of the parties in the coalitions, of course, are the religious. The old joke about Jews is that they always argue and fight all the time. Indeed, that has been a cause of anti-Semitism. Adolf Hitler himself wrote in his Mein Kampf, one of the reasons why he hated the Jews was because they always fight and stabbed each other in the back and showed no semblance of a nation that would stand together as one. Israel today fights and argues and screams in its parliament, the Knesset, pretty much just like all the other Western democracies do in theirs. So that's no different. But one of the minor parties, of course, are the religious. And because of the evolution of society, the revelations of science and technology, religion and religious understandings are transforming. We are becoming enlightened. We recognize that a lot of the old mythologies of religion are no longer as true as we once thought. They are becoming transparent. And in light of this, many of the religious leaders are becoming more and more rigid in their terror, in their psychological inability to let go of their facades and false beliefs, to embrace the truths that reality has dawned upon us. And that explains the psychology why certain elements in the religious community grow more and more extreme, and by doing so, become a greater pariah and threat, not only to the religion of Judaism, not only to the state of Israel, in my opinion, to the world at large. They endanger all Jews by their extremist separatism, elitism, and racism, and must strongly be condemned. When the state was established, this group was yet a small minority and could be tolerated. But that minority has grown and grown. And because of the divisions in Israeli politics, these people become a pivot, and they therefore gain more power in society than their numbers deserve. But that's the nature of politics, and I only wish I had the wise solution for it. In my opinion, the only solution for the problems and divisions in Israeli society would be to abolish democracy and, have a dictator rule, kind of like a Tito or even a Joseph Stalin. Can you imagine if we had an Israeli Stalin who would put his foot down? It might not be nice. It might not be in a relationship to our Western values and liberalism, but he would unite the nation. Better or worse, that could happen. But anyway, moving right along. Israel today is vital for the existence of all Jews. When the extremist element of religion tightened their noose around the neck of the nation and narrowly defined the definition of who or what is a Jew, and define it by their perverted interpretations of Halakha, they are creating divisions, creating strife, and they are causing great harm. I would only wish that the government of Israel had the courage, as the founding fathers of the United States did, to make an absolute separation between church and state, or in this case, synagogue and state. Now here, let's address the issue of halakha and the state of Israel. First of all, the state of Israel was not established to be a government in accordance to Jewish law, in preparation for the coming of the Messiah and fulfillment of prophecy. The government of the state of Israel has absolutely no connection to or no bearing with the religion and halakha, and thank God for that. Because, let's be blunt, as we all know, the majority of Jews around the world do not belong to the religious camp, not the good religious camp or the perverted forms of the religious camp to the right or to the left. And therefore, if Israel is going to be a nation for all, it has to include all and cannot submit to the blackmail of the perverters. What is the position of Jewish law? Well, Judaism, according to our halakha, our way, recognizes the authentic form of Jewish government to be a bloodline descendant of House David, who would establish a monarchy. Well, do we have authenticated bloodline descendants of the House of David today? There are those who claim that there are such families, even though I am sure that all those who have, in quote, traditions that they are of that bloodline, I don't think any of them can be validated or proven. As such, even though you could have someone who is accepted to be of the bloodline of David, I believe that that acceptance can be challenged. And especially if we were to challenge it in the context of Jewish law, halakha, I think it would be a valid challenge. And therefore, I don't think that we could validate and prove today the existence of anyone of a Davidic bloodline. So therefore, that would disqualify us from having an authentic restoration of a Jewish monarchy. There are those extremist elements today in Israel that want to rebuild the temple. The temple should never be rebuilt. And it will never be rebuilt. And if it is, it will be a focal point of a new Holocaust. The rabbis were very emphatic and clear over the centuries. Rambam Maimonides made it very clear. The entire temple sacrificial system was only an allowance for a time for the primitive, childlike people who could not disassociate from that form of worship of God. And that it was a blessing in disguise when the temple was destroyed. Because like it said over and over again in the words of Psalms and prophets, the true service of God, the true prayers, the true sacrifices are those that come from the human heart, the human mind, human actions. Blood of animals not required. And this sentiment is clearly echoed in both the Talmudic tradition and even in the Zoharic mystical tradition. Both state emphatically that the third temple will never be built by human hands, but will come down ready built from heaven. Now, if that is to be understood literally, maybe it's a mothership UFO to come down. But just in case it follows in the traditional norm of rabbinic metaphor, it means that the awareness of the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies and the, in quote, third temple, it will come in its own time, but not by human hands in its present form. When one reads the coming of the Messiah from Maimonides, he makes it very clear that it's the Messiah who is to build the temple. Well, let's wait for the Messiah to come, and then if he wants to build it or if it comes down from heaven, we'll deal with it then. But there are certain prerequisites that the Messiah has to do first, such as make peace around the world. When he does that, that's the guy we can look to and say, okay, if you want to build a temple or call heaven and have heaven deliver it, you get deliveries of Domino Pizza, you can get delivery of the third temple from heaven. Good, great, I'm all for it. But until then, we cannot succumb to the superstitious desires of the religious extremists whose intent is to destabilize the entire world situation with their perversions and misinterpretations of faith. Very, very bad. So, in halakha, the state of Israel today is not a halachic state. That's very clear, black and white. Even though the state of Israel appeases the religious members of the Knesset by imposing certain elements of Jewish law throughout the country and culture, I'm not so sure that is a good thing. I believe religious coercion in general is a bad thing. So I don't like to see a government-sponsored anything religious. I believe that our Torah is so beautiful, is so precious, is so enlightening, is so valuable. It doesn't need to be imposed on anyone. There's no need to coerce people. It can stand on its own merits. And therefore, if we abolished all religious impositions in the state of Israel, the religious would yell and scream, oh, everyone would be secular. Oh, I beg to differ. Everybody would not follow the perverted forms of the extremists. That's true. Thank God for that. But yet, the culture in Israel today is still very Jewish. People in Israel are proud, for the most part, to be Israeli. In spite of the inundation of hatred for Jews and the self-hatred of many a Jew, including one candidate for president in the Democratic Party here in the United States, a self-hating Jew, anti-Israeli Jew, whatever. Needless to say, Israelis are still very proud. And that is a good thing. But the great thing about the state of Israel today is that they are not a messianic state. And when I mean messianic, I mean that in a Jewish context, not a Christian context. Meaning that the people who are running the government of Israel are not apocalyptically inclined. They are not willing to follow the path of brinkmanship, like the old days of the United States and Soviet Union. They don't look at the conflict with the Arabs like a Cold War. In other words, how much you can push before you go to the brink of war. Israel does not seek a World War III. If they are pushed to attack a nation like Iran, you do not hear, and you have never heard, of Israel wanting to declare war on Islam. You have never heard, and you will never hear, of Israel endangering or threatening places like Mecca. It is unheard of because it is not Jewish to do so. In spite of all the extremists who would want to impose a third temple regardless of the cost. The leaders of Israel, both right and left, recognize the reality of living in this world. They are not apocalyptic in that they would want to push the envelope, force the world to accept its extremist demands, thank God they don't have any, and believing that, well, we all have to come to Armageddon someday, so let's make it happen. And therefore, we'll have the wars as described in Ezekiel called Gog and Magog. And ultimately, all the world will be destroyed. Israel will survive. And hallelujah, Mashiach will come. Thank God, the leaders of Israel do not believe in such fantasy. Fantasy! You really think you understand prophecy correctly? When you read in the book of Ezekiel the prophecies of Gog and Magog, when you read in the book of Zechariah the famous wars, and when you read prophecies in Isaiah and Jeremiah, how popular is it today that people all over the internet are pointing to this verse from Isaiah and that verse from Ezekiel saying prophecy fulfilled in our day? Well, let me tell you this. I can take any verse of the Bible and interpret it any which way I want. And I can turn any event into a fulfillment of prophecy. All I need is a little bit of cleverness of how to hang on to a verse like a hook and twist and turn its meaning and interpretation to apply it to something. And the people who don't know any better will nod their heads and go, yeah, I guess that's right. When no, in fact, it is not right. It is very wrong. For those who are biblical scholars, you can very clearly look at everything happening in the Bible today. I should say everything that's in the Bible, and look at current events today, and definitively, honestly, and objectively conclude there is no definitive proof of any connection between anything biblical and prophetic and modern current events. Is there a connection? Maybe. We'll know after the fact, just like Maimonides states we would. But we certainly do not see it and cannot prove it. And all we have is the faith of those who want to believe we're living in prophetic times. I believe we're living in miraculous times. Whether it's prophetic or not, time will tell. And for all of those of you who are sitting on the edges of your seat, watching the world crumble around us, saying, Mashiach has to come, Mashiach has to come, Mashiach has to come. He's coming soon. Yes, he's going to be here tomorrow. He's going to be here next Tuesday at 3 o'clock. Yes, I know our famous statement of faith by Maimonides. I believe in perfect faith in the coming of the Mashiach. And even though he may tarry, I will wait daily for his coming. And indeed, I will wait daily for his coming. But I will share with you now with clear clarity. Don't expect Mashiach in our lifetimes. I don't care how bad things get. I don't care how gloomy they are. We have been through worse times before, and we will be going through hard times yet to come. Radical Islam is not going to dissipate and disappear without a fight. And Israel may or may not take a hit. But Israel will survive. Jews will survive. Judaism will survive. Because we always have and we always will. That's the record of history. As for prophecy, as for miraculous interventions, believe whatever you want. Reality is on the side of the rational. I cannot tell you how for many a year I've spoken with all kinds of extremists in Israel and around the world. Everyone telling me Mashiach is coming, Mashiach is coming. I have heard stories dating back when President George Bush was in the White House, that he was army-los and he was going to start the war. And how many stories did we hear about President Obama? And how many stories did we hear about this previous Prime Minister of Israel and the present Prime Minister of Israel? And on the storylines go. More and more they're told, and everyone falls by the wayside. It's amazing that people can still have hope in such foolishness. The reality of the circumstance is profound and surprisingly explained to us in a very deep metaphorical symbolism by Chaim Vital in the writings of the Ariel. In the lessons on the holiday of Purim, in the Sha'ar HaKavanot, Chaim Vital uses highly metaphorical language to express to us a profound psychological reality. He states that in the days of exile, the mochin of Abba and Ima, which normally will go into the head of Za, are removed because Za in exile goes into a state of Dormita. And then those mochin descend directly into the Ahorayim of the Reisha Denok, to the backside of the head of the female. And from there becomes the building of her Sephirotic face Partsuf. Now let's put all the metaphors aside and get down to what Chaim Vital is revealing here. And as I said, this is a very profound psychological truth. You see, the mochin are what we call the spiritual powers, the powers of the mind, the integration of the intuitive and the rational mind. These forces, when in biblical times, would come to us through revelation, referred to as the head of Zer Anpin. But we say during this time of exile, revelation has stopped. And not that the forces of mind have been disconnected from us. On the contrary, they no longer go through the male face called Zah, through the force of revelation, prophecy, mysticism, and the like, but rather they descend into the head of Nok, specifically Malchut, which means us, humanity, mankind. And by coming into our minds, they take the form of rationality. And what we embrace with rationality and discover with rationality is equal to and superior to any and all the revelations that would come during the times earlier. And this is called Tikkun Hanok, the rectification of the female face, the building of the rational mind. Maimonides taught this. Abulafia taught this. The sages of the Talmud taught this. Whenever they taught us, don't learn what to think, learn how to think. That is why we learn Gemara, to learn how to think. You have to know how to think to be able to use the prophetic Kabbalah of Abulafia. And when you learn how to think, you will then understand how to understand Chaim Vital and his Kabbalah. You will recognize its psychological transformational abilities in your rational mind, and you will accomplish the purpose of the Kabbalah. Just as did the likes of John Locke, Rousseau, Franklin, and Jefferson, when they translated from theory to practice the message and meaning of our Torah and put it into a form which led to the formats of what we understand as our Western concepts of human rights, the value of the individual. All of this is our Kabbalah. And most people will never recognize it. This is the true meaning and message of the prophets. So you see, this prophetic message is the evolution of and the dawning of the Messianic era. And that Messianic era did not begin in 1948. It began in 1776. And it's a long, drawn-out process. Even the Ariel, Chaim Vital, in the late 16th century, the 1500s, stated they were living in the end of days. The end of days goes on for a long time because it's not something marked on a calendar. It's a psychological event of the development of collective human consciousness. And that indeed is happening now. And the existence of the state of Israel, as wisely secular and rational as it is, not putting its faith in something supernatural, but natural. It's the greatness of modern day Israel. Israel is a global leader in the development of technology. And even Israel's enemies, and those who are even apathetic to Israel, recognize the value of Israeli technological abilities. Not just in the military arena, agriculture, technology, computers, right? Where do you think cell phones were developed? Smartphone technology. Israel is a pioneer. It's a world leader. I don't know if it's the number one source in the world, but it's up there. And the world and everyone in it knows it. For the past few years, we know that there has been personal tension between the President of the United States, Barack Obama, and Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu. But with all the personality conflicts between the two individuals. As much as relations between the nations might have or might not have been harmed, the relationship between Israel and the Western powers is still very strong. Of course, the Western powers would love to see a solution to the problems in the Middle East and have peace, etc., and so on. We all want peace. I don't know anybody would be crazy enough not to want peace. Problems, of course, is how do you make peace with someone who wants to hate you and kill you? I mean, that's very problematic. If there was goodwill on both sides, you'd have peace in a matter of days, because it'd be real simple to occur. But when there is no will, well, there's no way. So what does the future hold? Well, the nature of conflict, needless to say, will continue. But Israel is a strong society, a strong nation. Very tough. To live in Israel today is very, very difficult, financially and otherwise. With the stranglehold of the extremist element of the religious in Israeli society, they're making it almost next to impossible for most Jews from around the world to come to live in Israel, to emigrate there, or to live there. That is something that the state of Israel will have to address. They will have to neutralize that extremist religious element and to open the doors again for equal rights for all Jews. That's a struggle the nation will have to address. So then, with regards to the future, Israel is not and will never be a halachic state. Should we hold our breath and wait for the apocalypse? I certainly hope not. I hope that we would never elect a president of the United States who would be so fundamentalist-minded that they would be willing to walk the United States into Armageddon, believing Jesus will come and save them. That is the exact sentiment of the Ayatollahs in Iran. Most likely certain elements in ISIS. They believe that if they can provoke the West into an all-out war, that the Al-Mahdi will come and save them. We learn from experience in our past. In the days of the Second Temple, when was the last time the extremists hijacked the government, took control, provoked a war? The Messiah did not come to save us. There was no miracle from heaven. On the contrary, there was a Holocaust, exile, destruction. We do not need to repeat history. So thank God the founders of the State of Israel today are more, shall we say, open-minded than the perverted religious extremists. And pray and hope that those extremists never, ever come to power. And who are these extremists? Those who state that the government of Israel have to follow Halakha. No, it does not. The State of Israel has no relationship in any size, shape, or form. Let those who live by Halakha live by Halakha, and those who do not live by Halakha, well, if the religious are so emphatically believing that the non-religious have to, let them go and convince them. We live in a society of open minds. If and when you are a Haredi missionary, an extremist missionary, you're going around to all the secular Jews, and you want to say, convert and become like me, and they do, fine. That's everybody's right. But if they don't, then thank God that most Israelis don't, well, that's something they're going to have to learn to respect. But that's not halakha. Oh, yes, it is. I'm not going to sit and argue with the extremists and their perverted views, because there's just no talking to a brick wall. But thank God that their power, however imbalanced it is and strong it is still curtailed. In the future, Israel will continue to develop economically, and in spite of all the present difficulties with the present administration of the United States, Israel has made tremendous political progress in the world. Israel's relations with China, Russia. These are important in developments for relations as the 21st century progresses. Is it possible that all the world will turn against the Jews and will break relations and persecute us, and we will have Armageddon and Gog and Magog and all the rest? Well, I guess anything is possible. But one thing I know, prophecy is a symbolic metaphor. And everything that's discussed again with Gog and Magog and Zechariah and all the rest, as it is described, was never meant to be taken literally. Because, like it says, it's in vision. And vision speaks the language of metaphor and symbol. So the entire war of Gog and Magog, the entire fight over Jerusalem, might very well be archetypal symbolism, speaking of psychological battles within the collective consciousness of mankind, and not necessarily about military conflicts to come. I don't know if that's actually what will happen, but I can tell you that is what prophecy states. As for the future, like we said, the Mochin are in the head of Nok. The Mochin, the power of heaven, is in us. And as long as we proceed in a rational, realistic, responsible way, Israel will navigate its way through the minefield of all the global anti-Semitism, all the problems with the Arabs, all the problems around the world. There is no one solution. There certainly is no straight line through all the problems. It is a dance. It is a zigzag path which requires wisdom and courage, toughness, and tenacity. And the government of Israel has that. Thank God. As for those who are secular Jews who disconnect from the people, you know something? I am very happy and proud that Jews around the world, hope and pray, will continue to identify with Israel and the Israeli culture. Because that is the one common denominator that unites us, more than all the different cultures and customs that religion uses to divide. Sephardi, Ashkenazi, modern Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, conservative, Reform, and on and on and on. Israeli. That we can be one nation. That we should be that one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Those of you who are here in the United States, you might recognize that as being the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States. That should be the Pledge of Allegiance. I have an excellent question here in text. Won't that lead to assimilation in Israel? Assimilation into what? That they will assimilate into Israeli culture? You don't find the Israelis wanting to run away from Israel to become Christian, to become Muslim, Hindu, or Buddhists. Granted, individuals will dabble with all the different cultures. And there's a lot in those cultures which are of value. It is a tradition amongst Israeli soldiers who leave the army. They go off into India. They go on treks into Nepal and things like that, and they find Eastern mysticism. But they come back to Israel. They don't stay in India. And they come back and be Jews. They come back and be Israelis. So the proof is, no, it does not lead to assimilation. On the contrary, it reinforces the value of what it means to be Israeli. That is something that we should always consider. And in spite of all the problems, in the words of one of the famous Israeli comedy television shows, Israel Nehederet, in spite of all our problems, we still have a great country, a great nation, which unites Jews from all over the world. And while we are patriotic and faithful, Americans, British, French, Mexican, Canadian, whatever country we are, Israel will always be a common denominator, a friend, and if necessary, a haven. So I conclude, and I wish my adopted nation a happy birthday to life. And I pray and encourage you all to do the same. Have pride in Israel, support the Israeli economy, support the Israeli agenda. Because Israel reflects the good and the best of us all. Thank you all for joining me for this class. I am, of course, your host, Ariel Tzadok. Come see me online, KosherTorah.com. God bless. Good night. Shalom. 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 Shalom.